Hey there and welcome to my first how-to video. I'm really excited to be doing how-to videos because I think they're one of the greatest assets that YouTube has to offer. I'm sure that you have used a how-to video to do something that you never thought you'd be able to accomplish. And it leaves you with this great feeling of achievement, a new skill to put in your pocket, and it probably saved you a little money because you didn't have to pay anybody to do it for you. I think that's awesome. You should also know that just because someone's on YouTube doesn't mean they're an expert. Besides poor video quality or poor presentation, there's also just a lot of bad information. So watch lots of videos and do your research. On that matter, I'm not an expert. I'm not even a mechanic. I'm just some guy that loves cars, and for the last 20 years, I've tried to fix things wherever I could just to save some money and learn a new skill. I think it's fun, and I hope that I can teach you something today too. Now, what I am experienced at is teaching. For over 13 years now, I've taught people how to fly airplanes and become professional pilots. And I hope that some of that teaching experience will come through the camera and help you grasp the knowledge for the tasks that I'm trying to teach you. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have flaws. In fact, I would love your feedback in the comment section below for anything that you think can improve my future how-to videos, because believe me, there's gonna be more. Now, let's get to the how-to video. Today, we are covering the replacement of the ignition coils and spark plugs of the Cadillac CTS VSport LF3 motor. Now, the LF3 is also in the CTS VSport, but that engine's turned 90 degrees, and the accessories, the wires, and the vacuum lines, those all may be a little different, so this how-to may not be perfect for that motor. This also applies to the LF4 motor in the ATS-V, or all the 3.6 liter V6s that GM puts in a ton of cars. There's similarities, but there's definitely going to be differences. So this video is very specific to the CTS's LF3. Now, you're probably watching this video because you're a V-Sport owner and you might have, I don't know, 40, 50,000 miles in your car. And maybe you're on the highway and you went to go past somebody. So you put the pedal down and all of a sudden the car jerks and maybe backfires or stumbles and you feel some shuddering. That's a great indication that you have a spark problem. A really bad problem, you would get a check engine light, the car might go into limp home mode, and when you get the check engine light checked out, it says it's the P0300 code. That's the random misfire code. Yeah, you've probably got an ignition system problem, and it's either the spark plugs and or ignition coils. So let's get started. I'll show you how to swap those out.
For this install, I'm using the latest GM recommended plug, the AC Delco 41147s. The coils I purchased are the exact same components that came with the car, the Denso branded coils. You can find cheaper options on Amazon or rockauto.com, but those are not the original components that came with the car, and I can't guarantee they will work quite as well. See my link in the description for proper coils at rockauto.com. Now for this procedure, you'll need the following tools. You'll need a 10mm socket, either a deep or a regular shallow. You'll need the 5/8 inch socket for spark plugs. It has a rubber insert inside of it. I like to use this long wobble extension, but you can also use a non-wobble extension. You'll need a good old ratchet. This is my 3/8. I like to have a magnet around because I tend to drop stuff in the engine bay. Dielectric grease is totally required, and so is some type of spark plug gapping tool. Also, a T30 Torx driver, and a small flat head, and of course, a good light so you can see what you're doing. We'll start by removing the engine cover. Use your T30 Torx bit to remove the retainer holding the engine cover on at the front passenger side of the engine. This is a good time to point out that I do have a custom intake on this car. I built it myself, and if you'd like to find out more about intakes for the V-Sport, join our V-Sport Facebook groups. The oil cap is also holding the cover down, so remove the oil cap on the driver's side. Then lift the cover from the front and slide it towards you. Make sure you put the oil cap back on. You don't want any dirt getting in there. What you're looking at here is the intake manifold and intercooler system. What we're going to do is get access to the spark plugs by moving the charge pipes slightly out of the way. They're held on each by two 10mm bolts. We also need to get some vacuum lines out of the way. So near the passenger firewall side, there's 3 to 4 connections that can be removed. Also 2 towards the forward passenger side. On the driver's side near the firewall, there's 1 vacuum line connection to remove. After that, we'll remove the coils and spark plugs for all 6 cylinders. If you're using a power tool, make sure the torque settings are set to the minimum, so you minimize the chance of damage to threads or bolt heads. First, we'll remove the 2 10mm bolts holding the charge pipes to the intercooler. I suggest using a regular ratchet to break these loose first, and then you'll also get an idea of how torqued down they are. I don't have any exact specs for the torque when you put them back later. Set the bolts aside so you know they're safe. Now also do the other 10mm bolts holding the passenger side charge pipe on. Notice the little black sleeve that's in there. Make sure that stays put, try not to lose it. Next, we'll disconnect 3 to 4 vacuum lines on the passenger firewall section of the engine. These are all held by these little gray clips. They don't need to be pried out with a screwdriver. Simply press on one side of them and they will release from the tube they're connected to. Now you may notice this doesn't quite look like yours. This little black section was pressed into the intake manifold here in this hole. Yours probably looks something like this. Be sure to put it back like this when you're done. Now this vacuum line you'll be sure to remove. Again, just press on the gray portion and it should release from the barb. There's another one here attached to a brass nipple. And then what I believe is the PCV is in the very back. Now this one disconnects a little different. See the little gray plastic lever? You just move it with your finger and then lift the connection off of the nipple. Now move to the passenger side forward section of the engine. There are 2 vacuum lines we need to disconnect there. There's this one with a little bit of green. Press the gray portion of the clip and simply pull it off. You can move the hoses slightly out of the way. Using one hand, hold the charge pipe back, reach down and grab what I believe is the PCV hose. One end of it was the last connector you disconnected near the firewall. Carefully pull it out. Then on the other end, you can remove the connection, or if you're comfortable with it laying out like this, you can leave it. This end of the hose also has the same connection with the small plastic lever. Now you may be tempted to remove this clip that holds the blow-off valve on, but it becomes brittle with age, so don't mess with it. The Viton seal on the charge pipe is supposed to be replaced each time you remove it. But as long as it doesn't have any severe nicks or cuts in it, it should be fine. I've removed mine about 6 times. Now on the driver's side firewall section, you're going to remove 1 vacuum connector. Same press clip. Don't use a screwdriver, you will regret it. Towards the front of the driver's side section of the engine, the vacuum lines are held together by a little group clip. You may want to separate those just to give yourself a little more flexibility of the lines. I did, but it's not necessary. Now that you have vacuum lines out of the way, we need to remove the 3 spark plugs and coils on each side of the engine. Each coil is shown here in black with a silver 10mm bolt holding them on. Over on the driver's side, you see similar setup. The vacuum lines can be moved easily out of the way now that we've disconnected one end. Use your ratchet or power tool to remove the 10mm bolts holding each of the 6 coils on. Each coil has an electric connector going to it. Slide the gray lock back with the screwdriver and then press with your thumb on the button to disconnect the connector from the coil. Now technically you don't have to remove these connectors to pull out the coils. If you're not changing out your coils, you can leave them connected, but it's difficult to get the coils out without putting stress on the wires. There's just not a lot of room. These wires aren't easily replaceable and you don't want them damaged, so I suggest removing the connector every time. After you get the 3 coils out from the driver's side, move on to the passenger side. Or if you want, you can continue removing the spark plugs from the driver's side. It doesn't really matter. Once the coils are removed, you can look down the holes and see the spark plug. You can see it has a 5/8 inch hex head on it. Use your 5/8 inch spark plug socket to remove the spark plug. Notice how much torque's holding it in. This will be useful later when you put the spark plugs back in. Now on the 2 middle cylinders, be sure to hold the charge pipe back. You don't want your metal tools scraping up the mating surfaces of the charge pipe and the intercooler. You also don't want to damage the seal. Over on the passenger side, I'm breaking the spark plugs loose with a regular ratchet. As I said before, this is what I recommend you do if you've never done this before. Then I use my driver to quickly unscrew the spark plugs. Here are the coils, the new spark plugs, and the old spark plugs laid out as seen from the front of the engine. Looking closely at the used spark plugs, on the white portion, the insulator, we'll see small burn marks. This isn't a good thing. It indicates that spark has jumped through and onto the insulator instead of the terminal on the right side of the screen. Look closely, and you can see that the insulator has a deep burned gouge in it. This one has 2, just on this side. Looking at the other spark plugs, it seems they all have some sort of burn on the insulator. This is definitely a good time to replace these plugs. Now to gap the spark plugs, you can use these cheap AutoZone type coin gappers, but they're not very accurate. In fact, they can usually be pretty wrong. How to use it is you just put the edge into the gap and then slide it around until the spark plug gently stops. In this case, this plug seems to be gapped at 0.033 inches. A more accurate tool is a feeler gauge. With this, you use different thickness pieces of metal and you combine them to get the gap you want. Put them all together and then slide them into the gap between the electrodes. If they don't fit, you'll need to make an adjustment to the gap. If the gap is too narrow, you can use the coin type gapper to gently pry open the gap. Just use a little pressure from your thumb. Don't pry too hard. You can repeat this process until you get the right gap. To close the gap, firmly press the electrode on a hard surface. I used to tap the electrodes, but it's not great for the spark plug, and although I never had any problems, I prefer to press now. If your car is stock, set the gap to 0.035 inches. If you're tuned, try starting at 0.028 inches. Many people have had luck with this setup. Later, looking back at this footage, I saw that I actually gapped mine to 0.0325. The bigger the gap, without the spark getting blown out and causing misfires, is better. Now that your plugs are properly gapped, it's time to prepare the ignition coil and the plugs to be installed in the car. The spark plug's insulated section slides right up into the coil. Notice it's a firm fit. It keeps the air out and makes sure the electricity passes through the coil into the spark plug and jumps the gap while it's in the combustion chamber. In order to make a tighter, more insulated seal, we're going to use dielectric grease available at your local auto parts store. What you do is you put the dielectric grease either on the insulator or inside the rubber tip of the spark plug coil. I prefer putting it in the hole. I think the grease gets distributed better than putting it on the insulator. Now you don't need much, just enough to make a thin film around the insulator when the spark plug is placed into the ignition coil. Now you're all set to reinstall the plugs and put the ignition coils back in. Put the new spark plug into the spark plug socket. Some people like to put anti-seize on the threads, but it didn't come like that from the factory, so I usually don't. Carefully slide it down in. Get the threads started with your hand. Make sure they're turning smooth before you apply any torque or power tools. Again, on my power tool, I've set the torque to the minimal setting. This ensures that I don't over torque the spark plug once it's screwed down. In fact, I recommend you get it down there with your hand, get the spark plug to seat, and then once it's snug, you can turn it another 1/16th to an 1/8 turn. It does not have to be muscled on. It just needs to be on snug enough that it's not going to back out. If you put it too tight, and where you break a spark plug, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So be real careful. Now here you'll see me screw it down with my fingers till it's finger tight, and then use the ratchet to just turn it a little more to have it nice and snug. Now take your new ignition coils and drop them down into the hole. Make sure they seat firmly onto the spark plugs. You may even feel just a little bit of a click. Don't be like me and accidentally leave a connector just under the coil, because it won't quite seat properly. Make sure the connectors are clear. Put all of the ignition coils into the holes, and then we'll bolt them down with their 10mm bolts. If you're new to this, I suggest getting the 10mm bolts started by hand. Maybe just use the extension and socket. You don't want to drop one of the bolts. In this engine bay, if a bolt drops down, it can get stuck on the splash shields underneath. Makes it really difficult to find the bolt. Once you get the bolts mostly down and snug, you'll want to go back and torque them down with your hand ratchet. Like the spark plugs, they don't need to be super tight. Just make them snug and add about an 1/8 of a turn or so. After you've installed each coil, reconnect the connectors and make sure you push the little gray lock back into place. After all 6 coils are bolted in and the connectors back on, reconnect your vacuum lines. Remember, there's this one by the firewall on the driver's side, and then on the passenger side, there's 3 or 4 depending on how many you disconnected. Start by putting the PCV tube back in before you put the charge pipe back on. it should click down firmly in place over the nipple. Don't forget the other end. Connect the vacuum line with the green on it near the front of the passenger side. Reconnect those vacuum connectors near the firewall on the passenger side. There should be at least 3 that you disconnected. The one I'm reconnecting here, remember, it needs to go back to where it's attached to the intake manifold cover, as shown in the following picture. After that's put into place, you can connect the last vacuum connector on the intake manifold. Now it's time to bolt the charge pipes back onto the intake manifold. Remember, it just takes the 2 10mm bolts. Now, because the charge pipe has a seal on it, we're going to use standard technique to bolt the charge pipes back in and not cause any sealing issues. What you do is put each bolt in and screw them in until the charge pipe just starts to touch the face of the intake manifold. Then, turn one nut a ways and then go to the other one. Go back and forth until they're both evenly sealing against the intake manifold and torque them down alternately. This makes for a nice even seal. After you have the charge pipes connected and torqued down and you've double checked your vacuum connections, it's time to start the engine. After the engine is warmed up, give it a few revs with the gas pedal. If it stumbles, you probably didn't get all the vacuum lines connected properly, so go back and double check. If it's idling very rough, you may have misconnected a spark plug. If everything is good, remove the oil cap, get your engine cover, and put it back on. Put the tabs on the back of the engine cover near the firewall, press it down, put the oil cap back on, and then get your screw with your T30 Torx driver and screw it down. Now, before closing your hood, don't make the rookie mistake of leaving leftover parts or tools all around the engine bay. When you close the hood, you could cause some damage to your car. If it's all clear, shut the hood and you're done. Always clean your tools before you put them away.
Well, we've done it. We've changed the spark plugs and ignition coils in our CTS, and now it's running great. Now, changing spark plugs and ignition components, it's pretty much the same concept in all engines, but they're all a little different in some way, you know, like with the vacuum lines and wiring and such. So an experienced person can take on a new engine and they can usually sort it out, but it takes a lot of extra time. And if you're an experienced person, I hope this video helped make that process go a little bit smoother. And if you've never done this before, I hope this video helps you change your spark plugs successfully and now your car is running great. Also, I've got a ton more how-to videos coming, so hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. One more thing, I would love to know about how-to videos that you've used that have helped you do something that you never thought you'd be able to do. Please post a link to that video in the comment section. I would love to see it. Until next time, thanks for watching the Jet Fuel Only channel.